Folks that are tripping on the election of Donald Trump who act like somehow this is a deviation from America's norm, that this is somehow some unique, horrible break with the history of the country. No, the glitch was the 8 years of the Obama administration. This is back to your regularly scheduled programming. The history of politicians scapegoating black and brown folks, blaming them for problems that they didn't create, and then getting votes on the basis of that, that's not new. Donald Trump didn't create that, didn't invent that. That's been going on for 400 years, back to the colonial period, before we even were a country. So the first lesson is, don't assume that what's happened all of a sudden is a new thing. Don't be shocked by it. This is normal for America. Welcome to your country. The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right? Because they think whiteness is real, right? But whiteness was created. Europeans didn't call themselves white. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other before we figured out there were other people to kill. We just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count, that's why. And so rich folks looked around, the ones that owned all the land, in the colonies, the colonial elite looked around and they realized something, that they were heavily outnumbered by African enslaved folks, by European indentured servants who were just one level above a slave, or other Europeans who weren't technically indentured servants, but they were still peasants, didn't have any money, didn't have any land, and they could do the math. They added it up and they were like, damn, we got to figure out a way to split these folks apart from one another or they're going to rise up and take our stuff, right? Because after a while, these black folks who were enslaved Africans and these quote unquote white folks who were poor Europeans are going to figure out they're all getting played by these rich people, right? So ultimately the rich figure out they got to come up with some way to get somebody in that group on their team. The easiest thing is to get the poor Europeans, right? Because at least they look like you. They sort of share some of the customs and the culture. So they all of a sudden create this thing called whiteness and they say, now you're part of the club. Now we're going to let you testify in court, enter into contracts, vote, at least if you're a man, own a little bit of land, at least if you're a man, right? And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. No more of that, because you're too good for that. And we're going to take the white men, now called white men, and put them on the slave patrol to keep black people in line. Give them a horse and a gun and a badge and make them feel big and powerful, right? They're still poor. They still don't have anything. They didn't pay the slave patrol well, right? Just exploited them, used them as a buffer between the elite and the other poor folks, particularly poor folks of color. And pretty soon the rebellions that occasionally happened where black and white got together to overthrow the elite, those stopped because the divide and conquer had begun to...
When Tim Wise talks about race in America, he isn't simply talking about skin color. Guys, Tim Wise, he's talking about power, economics, and the way people can be divided when they might otherwise stand together. That is what Tim Wise usually tries to say. And if you've been listening to the videos that I've been making for Tim Wise, this is the kind of question she raises. So we want to watch this video until the end and see some of his arguments through the entire video. Otherwise, let's dive in. I'll be back with more insights, guys.
For the last 8 years, as I've gone around the country doing this work, talking about race in America, and not just myself, other people who do this work as well. For the last 8 years, we have been having to convince people, particularly to convince white Americans, that the issue of race and racism was even something we had to talk about, right? Because people were convinced we didn't have to talk about it anymore because a black man was president. And of course, how can we have a racism problem when a black man is president? Which of course is not something we would say about sexism in Pakistan just because a woman, Benazir Bhutto, became the head of that country not once but twice. It's not something we would say about Great Britain just because Margaret Thatcher became the head of state on several occasions. It's not something we would say about Germany or Ireland or Israel or India or the Philippines, all of which have had female heads of state. We wouldn't say sexism was dead in those places. We wouldn't say misogyny and patriarchy had been eradicated there, but in this country, that is sort of what we said for 8 years about race and racism just because a man of color was in the White House. So for 8 years, it's been like pulling teeth, man. It's like holding people's hands to convince them that racism is the thing. Okay, here's the good news in this bad moment. We don't have to convince people of that anymore, right? The hand holding, the teeth pulling, right? We don't have to do that now because it's a little more obvious to people. Now, never underestimate the ability of white folks to miss stuff, though, right? So I'm not saying that everybody sees it. I'm just saying I think it's more obvious now, and the good news, if there is some good news, is that we don't have to do the 101, right? The good news, if there is some good news, is that we now have enough evidence, the resurgence of overt racism, not only in our politics, but around our country, the resurgence and continuation, really, of systemic injustice, ICE raids on folks that have done nothing to nobody, right? Talk of building walls, but only on this border, never this border, only this border, never that border. Because we're not worried about crafty Canadians sneaking in to take advantage of our healthcare system, I suppose, right? So we have all of this overt resurgence of Islamophobia, overt resurgence of the othering of those who appear and seem or pray or speak differently than the dominant group. So unlike the last 8 years where we were in this sort of intermission period, right? We're sort of back to the continuation of a long-standing tradition. Now, some of y'all may remember back in the day, some of the older folks in the room will remember back when Sunday football, NFL football, used to only be on CBS. It's before Fox had a license to show games, and it was just CBS, right? And there were usually 2 games a day. Now, I live in the Central Time Zone, so in the Central Time Zone, I don't know about out here, but it was 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock, right? And the 3 o'clock game, if you were on the East Coast or in the Central Time Zone, would always bleed over into the 6 o'clock hour, which is when 60 Minutes comes on, right? And so what would happen, now if you're on the West Coast, they would show it in real time, you know, because y'all were behind a couple hours, and so you could see it live. It didn't interrupt 60 Minutes. But if you were on the East Coast or in Central Time, it would bleed over, and about 6:15, the game would end, right? And the announcer would come in, and the voiceover would say, "And now back to your regularly scheduled programming." Right? That's sort of what the election of Donald Trump is, y'all, just so you know. It is back to your regularly scheduled programming. It's not something new. It's not a break with tradition. Folks that are tripping on the election of Donald Trump who act like somehow this is a deviation from America's norm, that this is somehow some unique, horrible break with the history of the country. No. The glitch was the 8 years of the Obama administration. This is back to your regularly scheduled programming. The history of politicians scapegoating black and brown folks, blaming them for problems that they didn't create, and then getting votes on the basis of that, that's not new. Donald Trump didn't create that, didn't invent that. That's been going on for 400 years, back to the colonial period, before we even were a country. So the first lesson is, don't assume that what's happened all of a sudden is a new thing. Don't be shocked by it. This is normal for America. Welcome to your country, right? Is what this really is all about. We have to start with that, and we have to understand the past and how the past connects to the present, so that we can understand this isn't a unique break with history. And the reason it's important, it's not just an academic point. If you want to fight injustice, you have to know the injustice that you're up against. And if you think that it's a new thing, if you think the monster in the room is new and unique, it becomes disempowering because you don't know how to fight that monster. If you understand that we've seen this monster before, that we've seen this movie before, that there's really nothing new about this, then you can take lessons from our history about how to resist and figure out how to do that again, you see? So we don't want to build up the monster into something bigger than it is. We don't want to underestimate it, but we also don't want to give it more power than it deserves. We have to dissect it, and we have to understand its continuity, not its unique rupture with the history of this country. So let's talk about that. Because see, as a country, we don't do history very well, right? We're a very, amnesiac type of country. We are sort of like Snapchat nation, right? And I mean that not just with regard to Snapchat. You know how Snapchat, you send a video and then your friend sees it and then like 10 seconds later, that is gone, right? It's just gone and it's never to be seen again. It just disappears. It's gone. I can't do anything with it. That's what we do with history. We learn history for about 10 seconds and then it's gone and we don't revisit it. We don't, metaphorically speaking, we don't take a screen cap. We don't look at it again. We just sort of put it away. And we act like it doesn't have anything to tell us anymore. But of course it does, right? And the problem is that we have a very blinkered, inaccurate understanding of our history, and it gets us in trouble. But if you don't understand the past, you can't understand what's going on right now, not just in our politics, but in our country with regard to race. James Baldwin talked about this many years ago, half a century ago. James Baldwin, one of the finest, probably the finest writer ever to put pen to paper on the issue of race in this or any other country, said the following about America, our historical memory, and white folks in particular, and how we as white people remember history. Of course, Baldwin, as a black man, understood whiteness better than most white folks do, right? And this is what Baldwin said. He said, people who imagine that history flatters them, as it does indeed since they wrote it, are impaled on their history like a butterfly on a pin and become incapable of seeing or changing themselves or the world. This is where it appears to me, Baldwin continued, this is where it appears to me most white Americans find themselves impaled. They are dimly or vividly aware that the history they fed themselves is mainly a lie, but they do not know how to be released from it, and they suffer enormously from the resulting personal incoherence. Now, that was beautifully written prose, but breaking it down into just regular folk speak, I think what Baldwin was saying was that when you've had the luxury and the power to fabricate your history, it not only makes it impossible for other people to live within that system, it actually makes it impossible for you to understand what you're seeing. You get trapped in your own lies. And what he was saying was that white Americans had spent so much time creating this lovely history of our past, this nostalgic fiction of our country, that we couldn't understand the injustice in front of us and how it affected others and how ultimately it would affect us. Now, what is the relevance of that today? The relevance of that pretty apparent, right? When folks walk around in hats that say, "Make America Great Again," they clearly have bought into a nostalgic narrative of America. The very nostalgic narrative about which Baldwin was writing. People who imagine that history flatters them, as it does indeed since they wrote it, make hats like that. Right? Because in order to have a hat that says, "Make America Great Again," in order to believe that as a political slogan, to use that in a political campaign and have it work, you've got to have millions of people who actually think America used to be something to brag about, and then apparently the wheels came off at some point in the last 8 years. Now, when you ask these people with these hats, when was America great? Please give me a day, give me a week, give me a year, give me a month. They never can answer the question because they know, well, they can, but they don't want to answer the question because they know that any answer they offer will make them sound like an asshole. What are they going to say? Well, 1955, yeah, it sort of sounds like an asshole. What are they going to say? 1923, yeah, kids were working in mines and factories at the age of 8, so you sort of sound like an asshole. You're going to say 1897? I don't think so. So the reality is that people wear these hats not because they actually are willing to engage a conversation. They use these slogans not because they are actually wanting to engage a conversation, but because they want to make a statement about their nostalgic belief in American greatness and how we have to get back to that. But if we don't understand our history, right, we can't understand how those kinds of themes continue to recur. If you don't understand the past, if you don't understand the predicate for what you see now, everything about today and about our politics and about inequality will confuse you. For instance, the very fact that a man can become president scapegoating other people for problems, whether it's Mexican folk, whether it's black folk in the cities, whether it's Muslims, whatever it is, right? The fact that you can do that is a very long-standing tradition. It's probably the most long-standing, the oldest tradition in American politics. Right? Blaming black and brown folks for problems they didn't create. In fact, if you had to sum up American history with one sentence with regard to race and economics in particular, this would be the sentence. The whole history of this country is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown people. Let me say that again. The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right? Because they think whiteness is real, right? But whiteness was created. Europeans didn't call themselves white. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other before we figured out there were other people to kill. We just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody. And everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count, that's why. And so rich folks looked around, the ones that owned all the land, in the colonies, the colonial elite, looked around and they realized something, that they were heavily outnumbered by African enslaved folks, by European indentured servants who were just one level above a slave, or other Europeans who weren't technically indentured servants, but they were still peasants, didn't have any money, didn't have any land, and they could do the math. They added it up and they were like, damn, we got to figure out a way to split these folks apart from one another or they're going to rise up and take our stuff, right? Because after a while, these black folks who were enslaved Africans and these quote unquote white folks who were poor Europeans are going to figure out they're all getting played by these rich people, right? So ultimately the rich figure out they got to come up with some way to get somebody in that group on their team. The easiest thing is to get the poor Europeans, right? Because at least they look like you. They sort of share some of the customs and the culture. So they all of a sudden create this thing called whiteness and they say, now you're part of the club. Now we're going to let you testify in court, enter into contracts, vote, at least if you're a man, own a little bit of land, at least if you're a man, right? And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. No more of that, because you're too good for that. And we're going to take the white men, now called white men, and put them on the slave patrol to keep black people in line. Give them a horse and a gun and a badge and make them feel big and powerful, right? They're still poor. They still don't have anything. They didn't pay the slave patrol well, right? Just exploited them, used them as a buffer between the elite and the other poor folks, particularly poor folks of color. And pretty soon the rebellions that occasionally happened where black and white got together to overthrow the elite, those stopped because the divide and conquer had begun to work, right? You could turn people against each other by telling those poor white folks, they got to keep these black people in line. And so that divide and conquer gets initiated in the colonies, rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Fast forward to the Civil War era. And you have, I'm from the South, right? My people, the elite in my part of the country, right, actually announced that the reason they wanted to break away from the Union and possibly go to war with their brothers and sisters to the North was in order to maintain slavery and white supremacy. They said that at the time. We lie about it now. And we say it had nothing to do with that. But of course, at the time, they didn't have any shame about it, so they just said it openly. Right? The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said that the cornerstone of the new government was the great truth that the Negro was not the equal of the white man. So that's the reason the Confederacy was formed and existed. But here's the trick. If I'm rich and I want to go to war to protect my ownership in other human beings, my property, but you're poor and you don't own any enslaved people, why the hell would you go fight to protect my stuff? Because I'm a rich person. I'm not going to fight. Rich people don't go to war. Right? Rich people get poor people to go to war for them, whether it's in 1860 or whether it's during the 1960s or whether it's today, right? Rich folks get doctors to write notes for them that say that they have heel spurs and that's why they can't go to Vietnam. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, you can Google that shit because he's sitting in the White House right now, right? Oh, I can't go fight. I have heel spurs. Send some poor kids to do that for me, please, right? So that's been a long-standing tradition. So the rich have to figure out a way to convince the poor to go fight for them. But that's a hard thing. That's like a hard sell, right? Like how the hell, why would you do that? Why would you go fight to protect my property rights when you don't own anything? The only way you would do it is if that rich person comes to you and says, hey, listen, you gotta go fight because we gotta maintain our way of life because if these people get free, they're gonna take your jobs. No, fool, they already got your job. That's how it works, right? Because if I'm white and I got to charge you $1 a day to work on the farm, but you can get a black person to do it for nothing because you own them, guess who got the job? Free got the job, right? So in a sense, poor white folks would have been better off joining with black folks to overthrow the slave system. That would have raised the wage floor of all working people. But they got tricked by rich white men telling them that their enemies were black and brown. Fast forward to the 1930s. And you have white labor leaders. They're not even the elite, right? The labor leaders are not the elite, but they're the elite within the labor movement. And even they had fallen for it at this point. So they didn't want to integrate their unions. And they would say things like, well, we can't have black people and Mexicans and Chinese folks in our unions because if we do that, it's going to reduce the professionalism of our craft. We have to maintain the integrity of our profession. No, fool, you need more people in the damn union is what you need. And if you don't let those folks in, guess what happens when you go out on strike? Who is the boss going to use to replace you? They're gonna replace you with the very same black and brown folks that you didn't want to work next to, right? And so at the end of and then you're gonna blame them for taking your job rather than the white rich dude for giving it to them, right? Divide and conquer, telling not rich white folks that their enemies are black and brown. And now we fast forward to the president. We got the president of the United States becoming president on the basis of that same rhetoric, telling not rich white folks that the reason they don't have a job is because Mexicans took them, right? That's the argument. Keep in mind, there's been a net outflow of Mexican folk from this country, out of this country in the last 10 years. Right now, border crossings and actual in-migration at the lowest level they've been since the 1970s. So anybody who believes that is a damn fool, or somebody who does not understand how to do research on the internet, or someone who doesn't care, right? But he says the reason you don't have a job is those brown folks took them. I got an email from a dude said this to me, it's like 3 years ago, young dude, and I knew it was gonna be crazy because it was all capital letters and right? Don't send me. If you don't like me, I don't care, it's fine. I'm a grown man, I don't really need your love or your support, but just don't send me a damn email with all capital letters. Like, you can keep the cap lock off and tell me to go to hell. You don't have to scream it, right? But this kid was screaming it, and he says, I can't find a job. Oh, Jesus, I can't find a job because black and Mexican folks took them all. Really? Blacks and Mexicans took all the jobs, all of them? Right? Then how is it that black folks and Latino folks are significantly more likely than white folks to be out of work? If that were true, why is it that black folks with a college degree are twice as likely as whites with a degree to be out of work? Latino folk with a degree, 50% more likely than white folks with a degree to be out of work. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with a degree, 23% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. Our indigenous brothers and sisters with a degree, 2/3 more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. So I don't know where these people of color are taking all these damn jobs, but I know they are not taking them far. It's like they took them a block and a half and were like, yeah, I don't like that job anymore, I'm done with it, right? But this kid was convinced that's why he couldn't find work. Now, it's sort of ironic, though, because like the next paragraph is the paragraph where he told me that blacks and Mexicans are all lazy. All right, which is it? Because it can't be both, right? Because like if you took all the jobs, I'm pretty sure you're the opposite of lazy. That takes a lot of energy, running around from job to damn job. You can't be lazy and do that. And if you are lazy, I'm pretty sure you didn't even take one job, let alone all the damn jobs. I have this image in my head when people say this, right? Black people taking all the jobs. I have this image of like some farmer in Iowa getting up at 4 a.m. to milk the cows, right? And he walks out to the barn, time to milk the cows, time to milk the cows. And he gets out there, well, these cows have already been milked. Who did this? And then some black dude pops his head around the barn and goes, I did it! I took your job. That doesn't happen. Why would anybody believe it? But if a president or a presidential candidate says it, right, and you're hurting and you are out of work, it's easier to blame that scapegoat than it is to figure out that the global economy isn't made for you, isn't made for working people, whether they're black, white, or otherwise, right? It wasn't Mexicans that jacked up Wall Street. It wasn't black folks that destroyed the banking industry. That was just rich, high SAT having white boys. That's who did that. Right? It was white men with college degrees and business degrees and high test scores. They're the ones that stole or lost $12.5 trillion of other people's money. And they did all that in 18 months, destroyed the economy. There wasn't a Mexican person in the room, documented or not. Right? There wasn't a black person within 50 yards of any of them. Right? There were no Asian Americans, no indigenous people, very few, if any, Muslims in the room. It was just white, probably, just dudes that just real smart, and so smart that they lost all that money or stole it or squandered it. And I know people get very uptight when I mention that they were white. Sometimes people are like, why do you have to point out that they were white? That's sort of racist. No, it's descriptive, right? And if they had all been black and brown, somebody would have pointed that shit out. Like if it was all black people and all Mexicans, I'm really confident that somebody would have said, no more banking jobs for blacks and Mexicans. Right? If black folks had lost all that money, $12.5 trillion, I guarantee you no bank would have hired a black person for any bank job, not even like a teller job ever again. That would have been it. But white guys destroy the economy and they keep getting bonuses. How does that happen? Right? Because we're blaming the wrong people. We're not blaming the people at the top for the job situation that young man is facing and millions of other white folks are in fact facing. We're instead blaming the people at the bottom because it's what we've done for 400 years. Right? Same thing with that border. Oh, we're going to build a wall. That'll solve your problems. Right? You think? Is that how capitalism works? right? You think that's how capitalism works? You just build a wall and all of a sudden everybody gets a big fat raise? Is that what you think happens, right? Of course not. The corporate executives in this country are going to continue to move their jobs overseas. They can continue to send their jobs elsewhere, put their plant in another country because it's cheaper, because there aren't labor protections or environmental protections. Nothing's going to stop that. I know Donald Trump apparently thinks that sending out some really mean tweets at 3:30 in the morning will intimidate corporate executives. Corporate executives don't give a damn about his tweeting habits, man. 3:30 in the morning, Donald Trump sends out a tweet. If you got $40 billion of investment on the line, you don't give a damn what Donald Trump said. You're still going to move those jobs. Right? Those jobs are still moving as we speak. He takes credit anytime a company says they're not going to move. He ignores all the times that they continue to do so. Capital will always jump across borders under capitalism. Goods will always cross borders under capitalism. If you allow goods to cross and capital to cross, but you don't let labor cross, looking for a higher wage, guess what? The game is tilted against working people by definition. And not just working people down there, working people up here, who would actually be better off with a larger, more militant working class, fighting for better wages and working conditions for all people in the hemisphere, right? But we don't talk about that because we'd rather blame these folks. If we could just build a wall, everything will be fine, right? Not understanding both the humanitarian component of that, but also the practical component, because that's a cheap and easy answer, isn't it? It's a way of saying that we don't have to actually do the hard work of rebuilding an economy that works for everyone.
Hello guys, I want to appreciate you for making to this far end of this video, where I do usually make the comments of the video that you have just watched. So guys, one of the most interesting ideas in Team Whyte's discussion is the history of what we now call whiteness. You know, Whyte argues that whiteness as a social and political category wasn't simply a natural identity that always existed in modern forms. You know, he points to the 1600 when colonial elites had a major problem on their lands. There was a poor Europeans and enslaved black people living under systems that benefited wealth and land owners and political elites. And if those groups had recognized their shared economic interest and united, that could have threatened the existing power structure, guys. So, according to Wise, or what Wise is trying to say, is that a system developed where people, Europeans, were given certain privileges based on their racial status. They might still be poor. They might still have very little political or economic power, but they were given a social position above the black people. And that difference mattered because sometimes people don't need to be wealth to defend a system. They only need to believe that despite their struggles, they are still better off than someone else. You know, that is where Wise his idea of a divide and conquer became important. Instead of poor and working class people asking why wealth and power are concentrated at the top, they can be encouraged to blame another group at the bottom. And Wise argues that this pattern has appeared repeatedly throughout American history. You know, during different periods, Black Americans, immigrants, and other marginalized communities have been portrayed as the reason ordinary workers are struggling today. But Wise argues that the economic reality is much more complicated, guys. Take the argument that immigrants or people of color are taking all the jobs. His response is essentially this: look at who actually controls the economic decision. If a company moves a factory overseas, that isn't something an immigrant worker decided. If wages are kept low, that isn't necessarily because another worker is willing to work. If corporations make decisions that prioritize profits, those decisions are being made by people with considerably more economic power than the average workers. And this is where Wise connects the race to economics. He argues that working class people can sometimes be persuaded to look sideways at each other instead of looking upwards at the structure controlling wealth and economic opportunity. A black worker and a white worker may both be struggling to pay their bills. They may both worry about housing. They may both worry about wages. They may both worry about job securities. Yet political rhetoric can convince them that their biggest enemy is each other. And that is where we get it wrong, guys. And when that happens, the people at the top can remain largely untouched. We have been seeing that in our country. A lot of people, they are fighting because of these political parties. And those people or those political leaders, they're just seated there watching people fighting. That is what Wise is trying to show us. Wells also connects this argument to modern politics, guys. He suggests that anti-migrants rhetoric and racial scapegoating aren't completely new development in America politics. Instead, he sees them as part of a much longer historical pattern. So, guys, what I can say is that from his perspective, political movements have repeatedly used fear of marginalized groups to gain support. And that is why he describes the Obama presidency as something of an intermission rather than a complete break from America's historical racial pattern. His point is that electing a black president was historically significant, but one political moment doesn't automatically erase centuries of social and economic structure. And this brings us to the biggest lesson in Wise's argument. That is, race and economics cannot always be separated. Because throughout history, racial division have sometimes been used to influence who receives opportunity, who receives protection, and who gets blamed when society is struggling. So, the working class can become divided along racial lines, even when many of its economic interests are similar. And once people are divided, building collective political and economic power becomes much harder. Whether you agree with every part of Tim Wise's interpretation or not, his argument forces attention onto something important, guys. Look carefully at who benefits when ordinary people are encouraged to blame one another. Because sometimes the most powerful form of political control isn't forcing people to agree, it's convincing them that the person standing next to them is their enemy. And when that happens, the real economic problem can remain untouched while the arguments continue at the bottom. That is the central thread running through theme-wise discussion. Understanding race isn't only about understanding prejudice. It is also about understanding history, understanding power, understanding economics, and the force that can keep ordinary people divided. Otherwise, guys, I want to say thank you very much for watching. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And remember, I'll see you in the next one, guys.